The first thing Alexander Hawthorne noticed was the silence. Not the respectful kind. Not the bored, legal silence of a courtroom waiting for paperwork to shuffle. This was different. This was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes your skin prickle because something has gone wrong and nobody's saying it out loud yet. Alexander sat at the polished oak table like he owned the room, because in his mind he did. Perfect posture, tailored suit, that faint, satisfied curve at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who had already won and was only here to collect the paperwork. Across the aisle, Sarah sat alone. No friends, no family, no designer dress, just a plain gray outfit, hands folded, eyes down. Exactly how he'd imagined she'd look today. Small, breakable, disposable. Alexander leaned toward his attorney and murmured, barely moving his lips. "This'll be over before lunch." He meant it. He'd planned it that way. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Because honestly, this story could happen to anyone. The divorce filing wasn't about separation. It was about erasure. No alimony, no assets. A neat little story fed to the press about a distracted wife who didn't contribute. A few ugly accusations, just believable enough to stick. And then she'd fade back into whatever nowhere she came from. That was the plan. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Not quietly, not politely. They slammed. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Heads turned, pens froze mid-scratch. Even the judge looked up, irritation flashing across his face. Alexander frowned. That wasn't scheduled. 6 figures stepped inside. Not court security, not police. Dressed in black, moving with calm precision, scanning the room like they already owned it. Alexander's stomach tightened, just a little. Then they parted. And 2 people walked through the center aisle like gravity bent around them. The man was older, silver hair, cold eyes, a presence that made the air feel heavier. The woman beside him walked with the same certainty, heels striking the marble floor in steady rhythm, a leather briefcase held like a weapon. Alexander felt something unfamiliar creep up his spine. Unease. The judge started to speak. The words didn't matter. The courtroom was no longer his. And then Sarah stood, not hurried, not defiant, just inevitable. Her posture changed in one smooth motion, shoulders back, chin lifted. The woman who'd spent 10 years making herself smaller vanished like a discarded mask. Alexander's smug grin faltered. Sarah spoke, calm and measured, her voice carrying without effort. "Your Honor, my legal team has arrived." Alexander laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound burst out of him, sharp and dismissive. "Legal team?" he scoffed. "What legal team?" The silver-haired man stepped forward. "I am William Vanderquilt." The name hit the room like a dropped glass. Alexander's breath caught. No, that was impossible. Sarah turned toward the man, and for the first time that day she smiled. Not weak, not nervous, familiar. "Hi, Dad." The word echoed. Alexander stood so fast his chair scraped loudly across the floor. "Dad?" he barked. "That's not... She's Sarah Jones, from Wyoming." William's eyes slid to Alexander. Not anger. Worse, contempt. "She is Sarah Vanderquilt," he said evenly. "And you've made a very expensive mistake." Alexander opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And in that suspended moment, as whispers erupted and the world tilted off its axis, Alexander realized something horrifying. The woman he thought he'd erased had been watching him the entire time. And this was only the beginning. Because if Sarah was telling the truth, everything he owned was already gone. 10 years earlier, Sarah had learned how to disappear without leaving. It wasn't dramatic. No disguises, no fake accents, just restraint. She learned to speak less, smile softly, let conversations pass over her head like weather. In Manhattan, invisibility wasn't about hiding. It was about being underestimated. Alexander loved that about her. At first, he liked that she didn't challenge him in meetings, that she listened while he talked, that she didn't compete. He told people she was grounding. What he meant was controllable. Sarah told herself that was enough. She watched him build Hawthorne tech from a cluttered apartment and borrowed confidence. She sat beside him at midnight, formatting decks, proofreading pitches, listening to him spiral about investors and failure. She rubbed his back when stress burned holes in his stomach. She believed, truly believed, that love meant building something together. But success changed the temperature of the room. Alexander stopped asking her opinion. Then he stopped thanking her. Then he started joking, casually, about how easy her life was. "You don't know how good you've got it," he'd say, loosening his tie. "You wouldn't last a week in my world." Each comment landed like a pinprick. Small, dismissible, easy to ignore if you didn't look too closely. So she didn't. Instead, she became quieter, smaller. She told herself this was what compromise looked like, that all marriages tilted unevenly once money entered the equation. What she didn't tell him was that she knew exactly how money worked. Sarah Vanderquilt had been raised around boardrooms and balance sheets. She'd grown up watching powerful men mistake politeness for weakness. She'd learned early that real power didn't announce itself. When she left her family, it wasn't rebellion. It was curiosity. She wanted to know if anyone could love her without the weight of her last name, without fear, without ambition muddying affection. Alexander had seemed like the answer. That was the wound, not betrayal. Hope. By the time she noticed the infidelity, the lies slid into place too smoothly to ignore. The missing funds, the coded language on phone calls, the way Alexander spoke about people as assets, as obstacles, as things. She stayed. Not because she was trapped, because she was watching. When the divorce papers came, they were almost a relief. Alexander thought she'd be devastated, thought the silence meant surrender, thought the lack of resistance meant victory. He never once asked why she didn't fight back. In the courtroom, as his lawyer painted her as lazy, unfaithful, insignificant, Sarah felt the old instinct rise. Shrink, endure, disappear. She crushed it, because she wasn't there to beg. She was there to stop protecting him. When the doors opened and her family stepped inside, it wasn't rescue. It was permission. And as Alexander stared at her, trying desperately to reconcile the woman who cooked his dinners with the woman standing beside a dynasty, Sarah understood something with startling clarity. He had never seen her. Not once. And that blindness was about to cost him everything, because the quiet woman he thought he'd broken was done pretending to be small, and the war he'd started was finally hers to finish. But Alexander still thought he could escape. He still believed this was just a courtroom moment. He had no idea how fast the city was about to turn on him. Alexander didn't hear the judge call for order. He didn't hear the murmurs swelling into open disbelief. He barely registered his own attorney whispering his name, urgently tugging at his sleeve. All he could see was Sarah, not the version of her he'd curated in his mind, not the woman who waited up with cold dinners and quieter expectations. This Sarah stood straight, calm, unflinching. She looked like someone who knew exactly how this was going to end. And worse, she looked unsurprised. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. No. This was a play. A bluff. People didn't hide being Vanderquilts. Not for a decade. Not without slipping. There would have been signs, slips in language, friends, connections, something. "You're lying," he said, louder than he meant to. The words echoed. Heads turned. Reporters leaned forward. Sarah didn't respond. William Vanderquilt did. "You filed for divorce," he said evenly, resting both hands on the silver handle of his cane. "You tried to humiliate my daughter. You tried to erase her." He took one slow step forward. "That was your mistake." The judge finally found his voice, calling for a recess. But the damage was already done. The illusion Alexander had built around himself was crumbling, brick by brick, and everyone in the room could feel it. His attorney leaned close, whispering frantically about jurisdiction, about motions, about damage control. Alexander barely heard him, because Sarah was looking at him, not with anger, with something far colder, pity. The recess was supposed to last an hour. Alexander didn't stay to find out. He pushed past the press, past the questions, past the stares that suddenly felt sharp instead of admiring. Outside, Manhattan's noise slammed into him like a physical force. Horns, sirens, voices. The city didn't care that his world was ending. He slid into his Porsche with shaking hands. "It's fine," he muttered, starting the engine. "It's fine." He told himself the Vanderquilts couldn't touch him that fast. Corporate structures took time. Legal teams took weeks. Assets didn't just vanish. He pulled into traffic, heart hammering. His phone buzzed. Leonard. "Where are you?" Alexander snapped the moment he answered. "We've got a situation." A pause. Too long. "You shouldn't come here," Leonard said quietly. The tone did it. Not fear. Finality. "What do you mean I shouldn't come there? It's my company." Another pause. "They're already inside, Alex." Alexander slammed the phone down. "No." He accelerated, weaving through traffic. Breath coming fast and shallow. He needed to get to the servers. If he could wipe the logs, move the money, shift the narrative, he could still survive this. The parking garage loomed ahead. He swiped his badge. Red light. Again. Red. "Access denied." His chest tightened. Security guards stepped into view. Men he'd hired. Men who used to nod when he passed. "Sir," one said carefully, "you'll need a visitor badge." Visitor. The word burned. "This is a mistake," Alexander snapped. "Open the elevator." The guard didn't move. "We've been instructed to escort you to the boardroom." The walk through his own building felt unreal. Conversations stopped when he passed. Screens went dark. People avoided his eyes. They knew. When the boardroom doors opened, Alexander stopped cold. Sarah sat at the head of the table. Not hiding. Not flinching. Waiting. William stood beside her, reviewing documents like this was just another Tuesday. Victoria tapped on a tablet, sharp-eyed, efficient. Leonard stood in the corner, pale and sweating. Alexander laughed, hollow and brittle. "You're in my chair." Sarah didn't rise. "I'm in the chairman's chair," she said calmly. That was the moment Alexander felt the ground finally give way beneath him. Because this wasn't a bluff. This wasn't revenge. This was repossession. And he was standing inside the asset being reclaimed. But the real betrayal was still ahead. The board vote was procedural, brutal, efficient, unanimous. Alexander barely remembered it happening. He remembered Leonard refusing to meet his eyes. He remembered the sound of papers sliding across the table. He remembered Sarah's voice, steady and professional, as if she'd been doing this her entire life. Because she had. When security escorted him out, he expected rage. What he felt instead was disbelief. This couldn't be real. Not like this. Not so fast. Outside, the cold air slapped him awake. His phone buzzed again. Jessica. Relief surged through him like oxygen. She'll help, he thought. She'll understand. He rushed into the hotel suite, words tumbling out in fragments, accounts frozen, hostile takeover. Sarah wasn't who she said she was. Jessica listened. Then she stepped back. "You lost the company?" she asked. "They stole it," he said quickly. "But we can—" She laughed, not kindly. "You were useful because you were winning," she said, already grabbing her purse. "You're not winning anymore." The door slammed. Alexander stood alone in the suite, the silence deafening. Minutes later, there was another knock. Hope flared. It died instantly. Victoria Vanderquilt stood there, flanked by officers. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said crisply, "you're under arrest." The handcuffs clicked shut. As they led him through the lobby, phones rose. Someone filmed. Someone whispered. Someone laughed. Alexander wanted to scream. He had nothing left. But somewhere across the city, Sarah sat calmly, reviewing files. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't angry. She was finishing something she should have ended years ago. And Alexander, staring at the floor of a holding cell hours later, finally understood the truth he'd avoided his entire life. The woman he betrayed had never been powerless. She'd just been patient. And patience, when it ends, looks a lot like destruction. Alexander thought rock bottom would feel louder. He imagined shouting, violence, some explosive moment where everything finally snapped and the pain became clean and sharp instead of slow and suffocating. Instead, it felt administrative. Cold benches, fluorescent lights that buzzed without mercy, the smell of disinfectant and old coffee clinging to the air. Time stretching, folding in on itself, becoming meaningless. By the time he made bail, his hands were already trembling. Not fear, humiliation. The world hadn't ended. It had simply moved on without him. Outside, a gray morning hung over the city. No cameras, no crowd, just an Uber idling at the curb. He slid into the back seat like a ghost, staring at his reflection in the dark window. His suit was wrinkled. His hair was disheveled. The man staring back didn't look like a CEO. "Where to?" the driver asked. Alexander hesitated. He had nowhere left that belonged to him. "Motel," he muttered. "Queens." The room smelled like mildew and regret. Thin walls, flickering lamp, a bedspread that looked like it had absorbed decades of bad decisions. Alexander sat on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, breathing hard. This wasn't how villains lost. This wasn't cinematic. It was small. He pulled out his phone. Notifications flooded in. Articles. Headlines. Speculation. Tech CEO removed. Amid shocking divorce. Twist. Who is Sarah Vanderquilt? Hawthorne Tech freezes. Assets as investigation looms. His name was everywhere. But the story wasn't finished yet. And that's when it hit him. The narrative. Alexander had built his entire life on controlling perception. Investors didn't back spreadsheets. They backed confidence. Employees didn't follow logic. They followed authority. If he couldn't win in court, he could still win in public. The idea settled in his chest, warm and familiar. Victimhood. He wasn't the villain. He was the fool. The husband lied to. The man tricked into loving someone who'd been playing a long game. He found a lawyer, cheap, desperate, hungry enough to say yes. Gary Finkel listened, nodding slowly, chewing on a toothpick as Alexander spun the story. 10 years of deception, emotional manipulation, a billionaire family playing with his life like it was an experiment. When Alexander finished, Gary leaned back. "People hate dynasties," he said. "They love an underdog." Alexander smiled for the first time in days. The interview aired the next morning. He wore a simple sweater, no watch, no polish, just a man who looked broken. "I loved her," he said, voice cracking at just the right moment. "I married Sarah Jones. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about the power. I thought we were building something together." The host leaned in, sympathetic. "And the allegations?" Alexander shook his head slowly. "Misunderstandings. I was trying to protect the company. I didn't realize the threat was already in my home." The clip spread like wildfire. Hashtags bloomed. Comment sections filled with outrage. Think pieces followed. Did Sarah Vanderquilt entrap her husband? When power plays pretend to be love, is Alexander Hawthorne a victim of elite cruelty? For the first time since the courtroom, Alexander felt hope. Across the city, Sarah watched the interview in silence. Victoria paced. "He's lying on national television," she snapped. "He's painting us as monsters." William scowled, reaching for his phone. "I'll shut this down." "No," Sarah said softly. They both turned to her. "Let him talk." Victoria stared. "Sarah." "He thinks he's winning," Sarah continued, eyes on the screen. "That means he's careless." She reached for her tea, hands steady. "And careless men leave evidence." The room went quiet. Because in that moment, Sarah wasn't reacting. She was planning. And Alexander, basking in sympathy, had no idea the real confrontation hadn't even begun. It was just being scheduled. The deposition was billed as transparency. That was the word Alexander liked. It sounded clean, honest, democratic. He walked into the conference room at the Four Seasons with his head high. Cameras waited outside. Supporters flooded his messages. Donations ticked upward. $50,000 from strangers who believed his tears. He believed them too. Across the table, Sarah sat calmly. She hadn't spoken publicly. Not once. No interviews, no statements. Just silence. It unnerved him. If she was so powerful, why hide? Robert Graves, representing the Vanderquilts, adjusted the camera. "Mr. Hawthorne," he began, "you've stated that you were unaware of your wife's wealth and that you acted solely to protect Hawthorne Tech. Is that correct?" "Yes," Alexander said smoothly. "I was trying to save what I built." Sarah watched him, not with anger, with memory. She remembered nights he'd come home smelling like someone else's perfume, the way he'd called her dead weight. The way she'd stayed silent because she wanted peace more than pride. She slid a small USB drive across the table. "Exhibit A," she said quietly. Gary frowned. "We weren't notified." "It was obtained yesterday," Sarah replied, "from the cloud server attached to Alexander's company-issued phone." Alexander's smile faltered. Robert plugged it in. Audio filled the room. Alexander's voice, clear, confident, cruel. "She's so desperate for my approval she'll sign anything. I'll bleed the company dry and leave her with the debt." The silence afterward was absolute. Alexander's mouth opened, closed. The camera kept rolling. Sarah leaned forward. "You said you loved me," she said, voice steady. "But love doesn't sound like that." Another file appeared. Emails, dates, plans, gambling debts, intent. The narrative collapsed in real time. Gary slowly closed his notebook. "You told me you were innocent," he muttered. Sarah stood. "There's one more thing," she said, turning toward the camera. "A clause Alexander wrote himself. Any officer found guilty of fraud becomes personally liable for company debt." She met Alexander's eyes. Hawthorne Tech owes $40 million. The blood drained from his face. That debt, Sarah continued softly, is now yours. Alexander stared at her, chest heaving. This wasn't revenge. This was inevitability. Because the biggest lie he'd told wasn't to the public. It was to himself. He thought power was something you took. Sarah had always known. Power was what you stopped giving. And as the cameras kept rolling, Alexander realized the story he'd tried to control had just turned into his sentence. But the final verdict was still coming. Alexander didn't sleep that night, not because of the noise. The motel was quiet in the way places get when nothing good ever happens there. No, it was the replay that kept him awake. The sound of his own voice spilling from the speakers, the confidence in it, the cruelty. He tried to tell himself it was taken out of context, but the truth didn't argue back. It just sat there. By morning, the internet had finished with him. The clips were everywhere, edited, slowed down, captioned, memed. The same mouth that had trembled on television now laughed in private recordings. The same man who cried about betrayal bragged about destruction. His phone buzzed constantly. Not support. Condemnation. Sponsors pulled out. Former allies released statements. Anonymous sources leaked more details, filling in gaps he didn't even remember creating. Alexander scrolled until his hands shook. He called Gary, straight to voicemail. He called Leonard, disconnected. He called people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old favors, old leverage. No one answered. By afternoon, a notice appeared in his inbox. Formal, cold, unforgiving. Federal charges pending. Wire fraud. Embezzlement. Perjury. He laughed once, loud, sharp. A sound that startled even him. This can't be real, he said to the empty room. But the knock on the door didn't wait for his permission. 2 agents stood outside. Polite, firm. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. As the cuffs closed around his wrists, Alexander felt something inside him finally give way. Not fear, not anger. Understanding. This wasn't about Sarah anymore. This was about consequences catching up after years of running ahead of them. Across the city, Sarah sat alone in her office. The building smelled like lemon polish and new beginnings. The hum of the city filtered through thick glass. She stared out at Manhattan, watching traffic crawl like veins pulsing through concrete. She should have felt triumphant. She didn't. She felt hollow. 10 years is a long time to untangle. She thought of mornings she'd waited for him, of dinners gone cold, of the way she'd shrunk herself so he could feel tall. Her phone buzzed. Victoria. "They've got him," her sister said. "It's over." Sarah closed her eyes. "No," she replied softly. "It's almost over." Because justice didn't end with arrest. It ended with reckoning. And Alexander still had one illusion left to lose. 6 months later, the courtroom felt different. Same walls, same bench, same judge. But the energy had changed. There were no whispers this time. No smug smiles. No expectation of clever escapes. Just the heavy stillness of inevitability. Alexander stood in an orange jumpsuit. He barely recognized himself. Thinner, grayer, smaller. The arrogance that once filled rooms had evaporated, leaving behind something brittle and exposed. He stared at the floor as the charges were read. Each word landed like a stone. Sarah sat in the gallery. She wore white. Simple, clean, unadorned. Not the color of victory, the color of closure. The judge's voice echoed, steady and unyielding. 15 years, restitution, garnished earnings for life. Alexander's knees buckled. He turned, searching the room. He found her. "Sarah," he rasped, voice breaking. "I'm sorry." She stood, walked forward. For a moment the room held its breath. "I know," she said quietly. "You're sorry you got caught." He flinched. "I loved you," he whispered. Sarah studied him. Not the monster, not the husband, just a man who'd mistaken control for strength. "You loved being better than me," she said gently. "And you never noticed when I stopped letting you be." The bailiff reached for his arm. Alexander's voice cracked. "Will you visit me?" Sarah paused. She thought of the girl who'd left Wyoming, of the woman who'd made herself small, of the life waiting outside these walls. "No," she said. "I have work to do." She turned away. As the doors closed behind her, sunlight spilled into the hallway. Outside, the city breathed, cameras flashed, questions flew. Sarah stopped at the steps, slipping on her sunglasses. "My name is Sarah Vanderquilt," she said calmly, "and I'm just getting started." She stepped into the waiting car. The door closed with a soft, final sound. And somewhere behind her, Alexander Hawthorne realized the hardest truth of all. The woman he tried to destroy didn't need revenge. She needed freedom. And she'd taken it. One last chapter remains. And it's not about him anymore. The sound of the gavel echoed longer than it should have. Not because the judge struck it harder, but because Alexander Hawthorne heard it differently now. Not as punctuation, as a door sealing shut. Bam! The word sentenced lingered in the air like smoke. 15 years. The number didn't make sense at first. His mind tried to shrink it, break it down. Months. Appeals. Time shaved off for good behavior. Anything that made it survivable. But then the judge continued. Restitution. $42 million. Garnishment of all future earnings. Indefinite oversight. No reset button. No comeback arc. Alexander's chest tightened. His hands trembled inside the cuffs. He looked older than his years, like someone who had aged all at once when the illusion finally collapsed. He turned again, desperate, searching the room like maybe, just maybe, someone would intervene. No one did. Sarah stood in the gallery, quiet, composed. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even tense. She was finished. Alexander locked eyes with her. And for the first time since the courtroom doors had opened months earlier, he didn't see strategy or calculation. He saw absence. The woman who once waited for him was gone. "Sarah," he croaked, voice rough from disuse. "I ruined everything. I had it all. I had you." She didn't move at first. Then she stepped forward, calm enough that it unsettled him. "You didn't lose me," she said evenly. "You spent me." Her words cut deeper than anger ever could. "You mistook generosity for weakness, silence for ignorance, love for permission." The bailiff tightened his grip. Alexander's voice cracked. "I don't know who I am without you." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "was never my responsibility." She stepped back. The bailiff led him away. Alexander didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't resist. As he disappeared through the side door, the room exhaled. The story everyone had been waiting for was over. But Sarah's wasn't. Spring had settled into Manhattan by the time Sarah returned to the steps of the courthouse. The air was clean, the trees just beginning to bloom. The city felt lighter, like it had shrugged off something heavy and unnecessary. Cameras clustered at the base of the stairs. "Mrs. Vanderquilt, is it true you're taking over permanently?" "Do you feel justice was served?" Sarah paused. She looked out over the crowd, the microphones, the faces hungry for reaction. For years, she'd been silent because silence felt safer. Now, it felt complete. "My name," she said calmly, "is Sarah Vanderquilt." The cameras clicked faster. "And what's next?" someone shouted. Sarah smiled. "Everything." She turned and walked toward the waiting car. Inside, the quiet was comfortable. William poured sparkling water into 2 glasses, offering one to her. Victoria flipped open her laptop, already moving on, already planning. "You did well," William said softly. "You chose dignity." Sarah nodded. "I chose myself." As the car merged into traffic, she watched the city pass by. The buildings, the people, the endless motion of lives intersecting and separating. She thought of Wyoming, of the version of herself who wanted to disappear, of the decade she'd spent shrinking so someone else could feel large. She didn't regret it. It taught her exactly what power wasn't. Power wasn't fear. It wasn't control. It wasn't dominance. Power was knowing when to walk away and when to stop giving. Hawthorne Tech would recover. The Vanderquilt empire would expand. Tokyo, Singapore, places she'd once only read about would soon know her name. But none of that mattered as much as this moment. The quiet, the freedom, the certainty. Somewhere, behind concrete walls and locked doors, Alexander Hawthorne would wake up every day to a life stripped of illusion. And Sarah? She would wake up to a life finally her own. The quiet woman he thought he'd erased hadn't just survived. She'd reclaimed her name, and the world would never underestimate her again.